All right, so hello again, and we are beginning our lecture about the 20th century. And I subtitled it as Allies and Competitors Again, right? Because again, in the 20th century, we'll see examples of cooperation and competition between our two countries. And both of them deserve some attention. So last time we talked about Tsar Nicholas II and his family relationships with George V. And we also spoke about Queen Victoria, who was grandmother of the last Russian Empress, Alexandra Feodorovna, and this tie which linked the two dynastic families, the two dynasties. And we also spoke of the alliance in the Entente of Russia, the Russian Empire, the British Empire during the First World War. But we also discussed the question of whether the question of the role of British spies in the assassination of Rasputin, because they feared that Rasputin could persuade the Tsar to conclude peace with Germany, and the British government was afraid of that. And we also, I think I also mentioned the fact that the British government refused to receive Tsar Nicholas II after the revolution. It wasn't because George V didn't feel this obligation to receive his cousin, but it was because the then Prime Minister of Great Britain persuaded him that not to do this, because he said this could cause some unexpected results, could lead to unexpected consequences, because he said they were afraid that the working people could revolt, and that could cause the fall of the monarchy in Great Britain itself. So George V freaked out. He was afraid, and he decided not to receive the family of his cousin, which of course puts a black stain on this page of relationships between Russia and England. But now I'm going to speak of the ups and downs of the Soviet-English relationships in the 20s and in the 30s, about some highlights. Of course, we're not going to go into detail. And I think that the first thing that we need to discuss is that England would not acknowledge the legitimacy of the new Soviet government. The British government did acknowledge the temporary government led by Kerensky, but when the Bolsheviks took power in late October 1917, this was, of course, perceived as a coup d'etat, and especially those measures, very severe and, we could say, well, gory and bloody measures that the Bolsheviks undertook in suppressing any opposition, they could not be accepted by the English government, and therefore, the Bolshevist Russia and the Soviet Union went unrecognized until a certain point. From 1918, 1922, you probably remember from your school curriculum, there was this period of intervention, of foreign intervention in Russia. And unfortunately, Britain participated in this as well. This, of course, was initiated by the foreign states as an attempt to help the Russian anti-revolutionary forces, to help the whites, or to secure the safety of cities against the Bolsheviks. But of course, this was intervention. And well, this is a map from a school atlas of maps, which shows you the different interventions of foreign troops. And we see that the British troops, the English troops, paid some special attention to what is now Azerbaijan and the shores of the Caspian Sea in what is now Kazakhstan, because there were oil fields. And the British decided to secure them from the Bolshevist government, as they put it. But in fact, of course, they wanted to take control of these oil fields. And so the French were in Ukraine. The English were particularly in around the Caspian Sea, right? American, Japanese, English, and French troops invaded Russia from the east as well. So here in the Far East. And of course, the British took under their control Murmansk, because this was a typical, well, this was a very familiar place for them, right? That's where they knew how to travel there, because you remember that Chancellor reached Russia through the White Sea and then through Arkhangelsk, so what is now Arkhangelsk. So even in 1922, at the General Conference, a British-French financial syndicate was created for the purpose of exploiting Russian oil fields. So you can see that it was not just the care for the safety of the Russian Empire, of the Russian citizens, but it was, of course, as well, it was pursuing its economic interests as well. Let's have a look at some screenshots from the newspapers of those days. For example, this one from the Northern Daily, Liverpool, the Liverpool Northern Daily Mail. British intervention in Russia. Millions saved from Bolshevik horrors. Well, of course, this was represented in newspapers as salvation rather than intervention. And they said that they could withdraw at earliest moment, at any earliest moment. So Lord Milner, Secretary of State for War, sets forth in a statement issued last night the reason for sending British troops to Russia and the work that has been done there by our men in conjunction with other allied forces. Lord Milner's letter is as follows. You ask me what right we ever had to send British troops to Russia to meddle with the international affairs of that country, and how long we mean to keep them there now that war is over. The question itself about that you misapprehended the facts of the case as well as the motives of the government. The reason why Allied, not merely British forces, indeed the British are only a small proportion of the total Allied troops were sent to Russia, is that the Bolsheviks, whatever their ultimate object, were in fact assisting our enemies in every possible way. So they said that the Bolsheviks were assisting Germany because they concluded a peace treaty. That's why British troops were sent to keep Russia in the war. It was owing to their action that hundreds of thousands of German troops were let loose to hurl themselves against our men on the Western Front. So it was made to look as for Russia to stay in the war. Well, have a look at another headline, Allies and a Murmansk Republic, for you just to get a feel of what was going on in Russia at the time. Well, of course, now we think that we're going through relatively hard times, but you can imagine what was, I mean, we cannot imagine what Russia was like at the moment. For example, the Murmansk Republic. A Berlin message says that it is reported from Moscow that General Gurka has been appointed commander of the Allied troops in Murmansk, New Republic. The same message says that under the protectorate of the Entente, the Republic of Vologda, containing Murmansk and portions of Russia to the Urals, has been formed. All well, well, in a way, that reminds me of that lesser known episode in Russo-English relationships. To remember from the 17th century, when the Muscovy Company sent a proposal to the English king to take under his protectorate a portion of the Russian state to the north of Vologda. So in a way, this was being effected there. But so there were many other flare points like this in Russia of the seceding territories, the territories that wanted to break free or that were made to want to break free. But well, after some time, well, the Bolshevik government cemented their power, consolidated their power, and the interventionists were thrown out of Russia. Well, a lot of Russian emigres went to Western Europe. Most of them went to France, which did receive a lot of Russian immigrants. However, well, England also did, but not many. Not many. And still there is a place in England, in Greater London, which is called Little Russia. Well, it got its name from the 1920s when a lot of Russian immigrants went and settled there. So something like, what's the name of the Russian colony in New York? Brighton Beach, right? Well, and other, well, enclaves appeared in different countries where the Russian emigres stayed. But when Britain has always been very pragmatic. To remember when the British envoy, John Merrick, arrived in Kolmogorov at the beginning of the 17th century with the plans, with the intention to find out more about the possibility of protectorate over the Russian North. But when he learned that a new dynasty had been elected, he did not pursue his plans. Instead, he said congratulations to the new Russian Tsar. He was quite a pragmatic man. So a similar thing was done by the British. When they saw in the 20th century, when they saw that the Bolshevik government was here for a long time and was going to stay in power, they were the first country who recognized the new Soviet Russia and the Soviet Union. This is why British diplomatic cars in Russia have their number plates beginning with 001, because this was the first country in the world which officially recognized the Soviet Union. Right. Yes. So very pragmatic approach. Well, however, this did not prevent our two countries from another wave of competition in the 1920s, because of course, well, on the one hand, it was quite clear that the Bolshevik horrors in Russia in the 1920s did exist. Lots of people were sent to concentration camps. Lots of people were executed just in the streets without any court ruling or anything. And of course, the British government could not cheer this, could not welcome this, and rightly so. However, there was one more reason why the relationships started to deteriorate, to worsen in the 1920s, and this reason was the communist, the appeal of the new socialist ideology to the people in the West. The Soviet Russia was viewed by many in the West as a truly revolutionary country, as an experiment, as a social experiment to overhaul, to restructure the society. And there were a lot of supporters of this idea in the West. Well, don't forget, this idea itself was not Russian. It was imported from Germany, and it had been sponsored English money, because Karl Marx wrote his Capital in his book, The Capital, in London, in British Library, and he was sponsored through a major portion of his life by Friedrich Engels, who worked in Manchester and sent Karl Marx £350 every year, huge sum by those days, by those standards. And so it wasn't a Russian idea. And of course, there was a lot of sentiment in support of these, not of the things that the Bolsheviks did in reality, but of the idea. And the English were afraid, the English government was afraid that the new Labour Party, which existed in England and which at that time protected the interests of the English workers, that it would gain too much power and that would lead to a republic, to overthrowing of monarchy. And so the English conservative governments continually made attempts to somehow limit the Bolshevik, the new Soviet Russia, and to continue this policy of sort of sabotaging the Soviet attempts to establish relationships around the world. And one of those was the Curzon's ultimatum, where he warned the Soviet government against their proactive policy in Central Asia, to which Bolsheviks responded with a propagandist campaign. And part of that was this caricature in a Russian magazine, Krasny Perets, which showed the new Bolshevik government writing a response to Curzon. And if you are if you're fond of the 12 Chairs by Ilf and Petrov, they do mention this. Yeah, and so you see here this Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, Kamenev, Zinoviev, Dzerzhinsky, and others. And the picture itself caricatures this famous picture by Ilya Repin of the Zaporozhye Cossacks writing a reply to the Turkish Sultan. However, there's and another piece of again propagandist campaign was this badge, which said that in response to Curzon's ultimatum, we're going to produce more military equipment. Like this is the face, and behind it you see a sort of a shell, and it is also blended with a gun. But however, although there was this big propagandist campaign, the Soviet government did, in fact, concede to some of the conditions that the Curzon asked them to follow. And well, another flaring point came in 1924 when there was an election coming in England, and the Labour government had very strong ground and had real chances to win this election. So the Conservative government decided to perform a clever trick, a hoax. A Russian immigrant in Berlin manufactured a letter which looked like a letter of Zinoviev, and Zinoviev occupied the position of the head of International, of the International Committee in Soviet Russia. What was International? It was, if you want, if you wish, it was a how shall I put it? A think tank, and also for exporting revolution to the West. In a way, it was something like USAID in the United States. Have you heard recently of the closure of the USAID by the Trump government? Yes, and well, in a way, it is the equivalent of what was the internet service. Exports what they call democracy, the United States influence abroad. Well, and the International was also, well, it was ideological led, of course. They wanted to export the revolution and these communist ideas abroad, but which, of course, also spread the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union and facilitated the position of the Bolsheviks inside Russia. So Zinoviev was the head of this committee, and the British government said that they got access to, that they discovered a letter by Zinoviev to the Labour Party in the UK. In this letter, the Labour Party was cheered and it was encouraged to take power and then, if necessary, to take some military measures and maybe to lead to the formation of the republic, but in any case, to organize a military resistance to the Conservative Party, right? So anyway, to take power by force. And Joseph Chamberlain, who was the then foreign minister in the Conservative government of Russia, also sent an ultimatum, a note, an order of protest to the Soviet government, saying that we are against your meddling in the affairs of the British Empire, that we protest against the Soviet influence on British internal affairs. And the Soviet government was alarmed because Zinoviev had not written this letter, in fact. They even, they wanted to prove that the Soviet government was not to blame. They did not encourage the Labour Party, although they did support the Labour Party. They never encouraged it for any violent protest or anything. So they even said, okay, we're going to give you access to the minutes, you know the word minutes, the protocol, so the notes of the International Committee in Moscow, so that you can check for yourself that nothing like that was taken, and no official letter, nothing like that was adopted in Moscow. But the thing had been done. It is one of the things of the information war. You don't care whether something is true or not. What matters for you is the effect, the information effect, and the information effect was achieved. All the newspapers in England wrote about the evil Soviets who wanted to produce a revolution in England, a violent revolution to overthrow the government, and, well, therefore to plunge the country into a civil war. And the Labour government either didn't win or fell very soon, and the positions of the Labour movement in England were undermined. Later on, it was discovered, the Soviets discovered this white immigrant who wrote this fake letter. When he tried to cross the border into Russia, he was captured and then subsequently executed. And then even English historians decided to conduct an investigation themselves. And in 1965, there was a book written by English historians, which was called Zinoviev's Letter, which convincingly proved that this was a fake, that Zinoviev never wrote anything of the sort. And this was used by the Conservative government in their inter-party battle to undermine the positions of Labour. This is a screenshot of an English newspaper of that time. It's the 25th of October 1924. Communism Unmasked. Zinoviev's very secret letter, plotting British revolution. The Foreign Office yesterday addressed a letter to the Soviet charge d'affaires, enclosing copy of a communication received by the British Communist Party, dated September 15th, and signed by Zinoviev, president of the Executive Committee of the Communist International, containing instructions for the violent overthrow of the existing institutions in this country. So that was a letter not to the Labour Party, but to the Communist Party, which called for a violent overthrow of the government. Well, in the Soviet Russia, what they tried earnestly to prove, but there was also a propagandist campaign, which you see on the slide. Our response to Chamberlain, the USSR producing more things, more industrial things, and building more airplanes, and well, just showing its economic growth. Well, a fun fact that well, that you might like is that some sort of personal recollection. I remember when I was a small kid, and my grandfather was somebody who was born in 1920, so he remembers those days as a kid himself. And so sometimes he would play with me, saying, when he was sort of trolling me or mocking something I did, he said, "So, what are you up to, Chamberlain?" And when I was a kid, I didn't know who Chamberlain was, but I got that he was somebody, a nasty boy, a nasty man. Well, he probably remembers it from his own childhood. So Chamberlain was a household name in the Soviet Union at the day. Well, however, the subsequent successes, we can use the plural form now, of the USSR, well, once again, well, one, in the relationships between England and Russia. As I said, the English are quite pragmatic. So the English started to cooperate with the Soviet government, trade resumed, and as soon as they didn't perceive a lot of threat, a lot of communist threat inside them, they didn't object to doing business with the USSR. And this, a sort of an interesting indication of the influence of Russia and of the USSR on the British mentality, on how they started to understand, to know more about Russia, is this distribution of Russianisms in the Oxford English Dictionary. It shows you how many Russian words were borrowed into English and recorded in dictionaries, starting from 1550 to 2000, to the year 2000. And here you see that the maximum is achieved, well, in the second half of the 19th century, when the Russian cultural influence reached England. And then especially in the first half of the 20th century. And here we can count, of course, the interest in all things Russian, which we discussed last time, the interest in Russian literature, in Russian modernism, in Chekhov, Dostoevsky, and Tolstoy, in Ballet Russe and Digilev's enterprise. But it also shows you the influence of of Russian things in the 20s and the 30s, and the 40s as well, of course. So, for example, if you look at the 20th century, you see that most words were borrowed in the 1920s, right? So the English were quite interested in what was going on inside Russia at the time. And there is the stable interest in the influx. Not many, overall, not many borrowings from Russian into English, but in relative terms, the maximum is achieved here in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and then in the 60s. And among the words which were borrowed in English at the time were Tsar, intelligentsia, Bolshevik, Soviet, Tovarish, comrade, Komsomol, Octobrists. Do you know who Octobrists are? Huh? No. Octobrists were, I think, well, a SERPA, social revolutionary party in the Duma. Yes, yes, but these Octobrists are that political party. Besprizorny in 1925, which also tells you something about the state of things in the Soviet Russia at the time. Agitprop, Yarovization, this was a new method in processing the seeds before sowing them, so in agriculture. Shock brigade, what is a shock brigade? Udarniki. Well, do you know who Udarniki were in Russia? In the 90s? Stakhanovцы, those people who did more than they were required to do. So shock brigade is Stakhanovцы. Oh, well, like Udarnik. Kolkhoz, Udarnik, 5-year plan, Pятилетка, Stakhanovite, also Udarnik. Red corner. What is this? Yeah, it used to be the corner where the icon stood, but because this was borrowed in the 20th century, red corner is where the portraits of Lenin, Stalin, and the revolutionary flag stood. House of Culture, it's also a borrowing from Russia. Gulag, unfortunately, and Constructivist. Well, there are more, of course, but these were just some of them that I selected to show you. Right. Well, next comes, of course, the Second World War. And once again, the positions of the USSR and Britain converged, got closer. And at this time, we see that, well, you probably know, I'm not going to tell you much about the different reasons and causes for that war. But before the war, the British government was, of course, politically very strictly opposed to the Soviet Union. It was afraid of the resurgent might of the Soviet Union. And you probably know that Hitler was, Hitler's economy was largely supported by American investors, by British investors, and the British royal family were among those who fancied Hitler very, very, very much. They admired what he did for his country, of course. And Hitler, in turn, admired the British royal family because the British monarch and the British Empire, because it was his vision of the German Reich. This was something that he had in view for Germany. He wanted to build an empire like the British had. And there was a lot of understanding between Hitler and Britons before the war. But then, well, there is even a theory that the English wanted Hitler to attack the USSR and for the two big countries to deplete their forces mutually to basically kill both of them. So they did not want Hitler, they did not think that Hitler was going to hit England first. But that's what Hitler did. He attacked England first before the USSR. And that, of course, led to, ultimately led to this alliance. So when England attacked the USSR, well, even before this, well, Mr. Churchill, on when the war will end. Look, this is just the beginning of the war. It's still 1939 when Poland was divided. And there is this famous speech by Churchill, Winston Churchill, where he says his famous phrase about Russia. Look, this is what he writes. What is the second event of this first month? It is, of course, the assertion of the power of Russia. Russia has pursued a cold policy of self-interest. This is about the partition of Poland again, right? When the German troops occupied half Poland and the Soviet Union occupied the other half of Poland. Russia has pursued a cold policy of self-interest. We could have wished that the Russian armies should be standing on their present line as the friends and allies of Poland instead of its invaders. But that the Russian armies should stand on this line was clearly necessary for the safety of Russia against a Nazi menace ugroza. So Churchill recognizes that this was necessary for Russia to take that part of Poland. They agreed with this. At any rate, the line is there, and an Eastern Front has been created, which Nazi Germany does not dare assail. When Herr von Ribbentrop was summoned to Moscow last week, it was to learn the fact and to accept the fact that the Nazi designs on the Baltic states and upon the Ukraine must come to a dead stop, where Russia, Britain, and France are at one. And this then comes this famous phrase: I cannot forecast to you the action of Russia. It is a riddle wrapped in mystery inside an enigma. And I would urge you to put down this phrase. It is a riddle wrapped in mystery inside an enigma. It's so to speak an epigrammatic phrase, an idiom almost. It is a riddle, zagadka, wrapped in mystery inside an enigma. And I think this is true about these relationships of Russia and Western countries in general. That key is Russian national interest. Well, he says, but perhaps there is a key to understanding Russia. That key is Russian national interest. It cannot be in accordance with the interests or safety of Russia that Nazi Germany should plant itself upon the shores of the Black Sea, so in Ukraine, or that it should overrun the Balkan states and subjugate the Slavonic peoples of southeastern Europe. That would be contrary to the historic life interests of Russia. But here, these same interests of Russia fall into the same channel as the interests of Britain and France. None of these three powers can afford to see Romania, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and above all, Turkey, put under the German heel. Through the fog of confusion and uncertainty, we may discern quite plainly the community of interests which exists between Britain, France, and Russia to prevent the Nazis carrying the flames of war into the Balkans and Turkey. And this is how this alliance was formed. So when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, the Allies decided to help Russia because there was real threat of Hitler defeating Russia in the very first months of the war. And Churchill, despite his aversion and disgust and hate of communism, decided to help Stalin. And together with Roosevelt. So this convoy, the system of convoys was launched with arms for Russia. A great convoy of British ships escorted by Soviet fighter planes sails into Murmansk harbor with vital supplies for the Red Army. So Britain and the United States started to send what was necessary for Russia. And it was not only arms, it was also food, it was also some, vehicles, cars, trucks, and many other things. And as once in history, in the 17th, in the 16th and 17th century, once again, this lifeline, not the lifeline, but the line of connection between Britain and Russia became this White Sea route through Murmansk. Have a look at this. All help for Russia now. Yeah, well, there were pages in our mutual history like this. See, these victory tanks which were brought to Russia by the British. And I think this photo gives a good idea of how Russian-English cooperation could unfold. Unfortunately, this mainly happens when Russia is in big trouble. I think we all would prefer it to be cooperation during peace times and cooperation for the prosperity of our two countries. However, historically, mostly that was during the times of trouble, though, of course, not exclusively so. And of course, I think we also have to recognize the help of England to Russia at the time. Of course, it was quite necessary, quite timely, and it did help a lot to the USSR to win this war. Well, there was even a newspaper which I found. Well, I found this screenshot of a newspaper which was called the British Ally, which gave an overview of cooperation between Russia and England at the time. So, for example, this is on an issue on the 7th of January 1945. That's an interesting example of a media outlet which is specifically dedicated to the cooperation between Russia and England. And here you see two soldiers, one of them carrying a Russian flag, the other one carrying a British flag, and a New Year address of King George VI to Mr. Kalinin. Right. Well, another name that I think you already know, but I just wanted to remind you of this, is this Lend-Lease. And this was later on in the war. This help was quite early in the war. This assistance to the Soviet Union, when it was clear that the Soviet Union stood the initial blow and that it was going to struggle and to fight back. This assistance, again, very pragmatically, was put onto commercial rails. And this assistance to the Soviet Union was called Lend-Lease. So these vehicles were, and this help was lended or leased. And the Soviet Union was supposed to pay back. And do you know when Russia finished paying back to the United States?
In the 19th.
In the 2000s, in the 80s, already under Putin. Yeah, 2006. So it was already under Putin that Russia finished paying back the United States for that Lend-Lease. So also the end of the 20th century, the Soviet Union was paying back to the United States for that assistance that it was rendered to the Soviet Union in the war, which to me sort of diminishes the role of that help, but at the same time it does not, because of course this was something that, well, even if you had money at the time, you didn't have these things. You didn't have the trucks, you didn't have some guns and some airplanes. And of course, this was vitally necessary for the Soviet Union. So it is still great help. We should say this. And well, a placard like this, a poster like this, shows you how people felt and how people in Russia were encouraged to feel towards the end of the war. So the Russians were already approaching Berlin. So Prague was liberated probably, and Warsaw. Although I think Prague was liberated much later. I think, well, Wien was liberated. Prague was liberated slightly, almost simultaneously with Berlin. But I may be mistaken. So this shows you like the three daggers entering. Well, come in. So the three daggers pointed at the German heart from the three sides: the American, the British, and the Russian. And yeah, just captures the mood of cooperation between our countries at the time. What else was present, existed, but something that we don't know much about, is that there was a special fund, Mrs. Churchill's Red Cross Aid to Russia Fund, which helped Russia too. And you see this slogan, help them now, so help the Russian people, the Russian soldiers, the Soviet soldiers. And it also contributed to this British assistance to Russia. So that was a very nice page, although it was a tragic page, of course, but in terms of relationships, it was a nice page, which unfortunately stopped almost on the 9th of May 1945, and even earlier. And now I'm going to tell you about the competition and the Cold War, which started, we know that it started in 1948, but in fact, it started even earlier. Unfortunately, it started even during the concluding months of the Second World War. Why? Because now, well, in 1944, in 1940, and especially, of course, in 1945, Russia was no longer, the USSR was no longer a failing state that needed assistance. Vice versa, it was a giant which was speeding towards Berlin at a very high speed, which was victorious, which was, of course, the strongest army, which had just crushed the strongest army on the continent, the German army, and it was very quickly, very fast approaching Berlin. So, and once again, the anti-Soviet sentiments came back. In the USSR, in the UK, in the USA, Roosevelt was the president who wanted cooperation with Russia. He saw a potential in this peaceful cooperation of the two countries. But his successor, Truman, Harry Truman, was not. He was a fierce anti-Russian, fierce anti-Soviet, and he only saw this Stalin's rise as a threat. And this perception, of course, he carried into politics and into geopolitics. And he in Winston Churchill, who had never been a good friend of Russia. He was a situational partner. He did help Russia a lot, but at heart, he never wanted a rise for the Soviet Russia. And that led to the fact that Truman and Churchill started to conceive plans against the Soviet Union when Hitler had not been crushed, had not yet been crushed. So among other things, we know that the Allied troops, when they received German troops or the German captives, lots of German soldiers went to the West Front and wanted to be to be taken captives by the Allies in the West, and they were kept in special camps, concentration camps, but I think they even were allowed to keep their weapons, or at least those weapons were stored safely for them, and they were kept ready in case they were needed. Because there was the plan which was called the unthinkable. The unthinkable was, well, you can put down the name of this plan. Now it was widely publicized. It's no longer a secret. The plan was called the unthinkable, немыслимое. And the plan was to attack the Red Army when the two fronts meet. So after the victory, the American and the English troops, the Allied troops, the French, the Americans, and the British, together with the captive German soldiers, so those soldiers who were captive on the Western Front, to attack the Red Army and to throw it back. Churchill didn't want Russia to get Poland. And indeed, he wanted to diminish the Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. He was afraid that the Soviet Union would get what it would initially get, the influence in Poland, in Bulgaria, in Czechoslovakia, and all those countries. And of course, that was a knife in the heart for him. So it was he was the brain behind this Operation The Unthinkable, and this is a plan what they wanted to do. First, they wanted to throw the Northern Army Group and the Southern Army Group were to throw the Red Army to Leipzig. So the first objective, right? The first objective is this line behind Berlin, so to get Berlin to themselves, and the second objective to get Russia, the Red Army out of half of Poland. But this plan was never brought to life. Well, for one thing, Churchill lost the election. Another thing was that the Americans and the other British people in government, well, realized that realistically, it couldn't go well, because the Red Army was the strongest at the time by any standards. So that they just probably calculated and understood that was not something that could effectively be pulled off. So this plan remained on paper, but it did exist. And I think it tells you a lot about the relationships between Russia and England, unfortunately, or rather the relationships between England and Russia, and the political line that the British government continually pursues. Another plan which existed, and this was already in 1957, is the plan which was called Dropshot. But to speak about this, we first have to mention that the Cold War started. It started in 1948, and who started it? When does it officially begin? Well, symbolically, yeah. Fulton's speech by Churchill. And I think it's also symbolic that this speech was pronounced by Churchill, the British Prime Minister, in the United States. And it was a speech in which he motivated, incited, stimulated the Americans to counter-influence Russia, to oppose Russia in this Cold War, to secure what he called the union of the English-speaking countries, where he called the Soviet Russia a threat. So I think it is a symbolic thing, a symbolic event, which captures, it mirrors, reflects very much what the Cold War looked like, right? So it was the Americans, but it was not only the Americans. At the heart of this Cold War lay this desire of the British to secure their influence around the world. Their empire was crumbling, and this is my next slide. The empire was crumbling, and it disintegrated after the Second World War. But they were still keen and wishing to preserve this influence. And that's how they used the United States. So after the war, British as a country itself was no longer as strong as it had been. But it had found a new incarnation. It found a new, well, how should we call it, zombie, through whom they could, well, influence vicariously on the other world, on the rest of the world. So in a way, they stimulated the United States to oppose Russia in this Cold War. And shortly after that, you know, that the nuclear weapons were tested. The nuclear weapons were tested. And the Americans thought that, especially under Truman, as I said, Truman was a crazy anti-Soviet, very unlike Roosevelt. And he thought that that was a good point, a good moment to crush Russia, to crush Stalin. Because, well, you also probably know that the nuclear explosion in Hiroshima and Nagasaki militarily were redundant. They were not necessary. The Japanese might had already been crushed. So there was no need to burn two cities, well, with civilians, two peaceful cities, with people alive. Like hundreds of thousands of people were burned to ashes. One of the reasons was to demonstrate, not to Japan, but to Stalin, that the United States, what the United States could do. And they knew that the Soviet Union didn't have the nuclear weapons, so they had a plan to bomb major Russian cities with nuclear weapons. And this is one of those plans. It is 1957 already, but that is a later plan. So the American bombers, bomber airplanes, were supposed to hit targets inside the USSR from various positions. You see that they could attack parts of the Soviet Union from the east, from the territory of the United States, some of them from their naval bases in the Pacific, some of them from their naval bases in Africa, from Europe. So they could reach almost every point in the USSR. And they wanted to bomb the major cities, well Moscow, Leningrad, Novosibirsk, and the Urals, where all the Russian industry was concentrated. So their plan was to defeat Russia permanently and to throw something like 30 or several tens of bombs onto the Soviet cities. But again, the Soviet Union got its nuclear weapons in time. And then the Americans realized that this thing would not go unpunished, that the United States would be bombed in return. And then, of course, Truman lost an election, and it got slightly better. And these plans were shelved. They were never brought into, thanks God, into effect. But they did exist. And that was not the only plan. It was called Drop Shot. It was not the only plan which existed to first hit the Soviet Union. And again, I wanted to draw a parallel with the Great Game, which I told you about last time, in the 19th century, which is universally portrayed as competition between Britain and Russia, as sort of equal dislike of the two countries and their counter offensives. But like then, and we have historically to accept that those were the British efforts to undermine Russian expansion, the Russian policy. Same here. The Cold War is not an equal opposition between the two systems, between the communists and the capitalist system. It was largely initiated and then stimulated by the West, by the United States, by Britain, which was fed by their fear of the USSR, of communism. And they had these aggressive plans. Whereas we know that Russia didn't have aggressive plans to attack India in the 19th century, except that Paul's venture. And I think that, Russia, the USSR didn't have aggressive plans to attack either the Netherlands or France or Britain or the United States in that war. So the Soviet Union in that Cold War was on the defensive side. However, the Soviet Union did participate and did strike back in a way. And if you look at the British Empire in the 1920s, you see that it still occupies a large portion of the world. It's still a country over which the sun never sets. However, the ideology of the Soviet Union, which promoted liberalization in the former colonies, did play a role in the disintegration of the British Empire. And in this case, it's a curious thing. Once again, the interests of Russia, the interests of the USSR, and the interests of the United States coincided, because the British Empire was dismantled not only by the Soviet Union, it was also dismantled by the USA, because they didn't, well, the United Kingdom, Britain, the British Empire, was a big competitor for the USA as well. And of course, the USA did not resist the temptation to kick the falling competitor. The British Empire was disintegrating also under the weight of their inner problems of the empire, and the USA did not prevent this fall of the empire. But of course, the Soviet efforts were there as well. So the Soviet Union did sponsor. We now know that the Soviet Union spent huge sums of money to support these liberalization movements in the colonies of Britain. And we also have to remember that this money was taken away from the internal development. It could have been directed at the development of the country itself, but the Soviet government chose to spend millions and millions of rubles and dollars on sponsoring the leaders, the enthusiasts in the colonized countries to fight for their freedom. Well, this is just a stamp which shows you, again, this is a piece. I think that, pieces of art, pieces of household things, they often tell you much about the spirit of the epoch, right? So I think this stamp captures the spirit of the epoch, when there was this parade of independence, of declarations of independence of the former British colonies. And we have to recognize that there is a lot of contribution of the Soviet Union to the modern map as we see it, right? The fact that there are so many countries in Africa, in Asia, in Mesoamerica, in South America, they owe partly their independence to the Soviet Union. So in a way, and again, it places us in front of a paradox. Or rather, it's not a paradox, but it's a paradox to mainstream thinking, because the Soviet Union was perceived by many people in the West as a fortress of totalitarianism, as a country which crushes freedom. But in fact, it was also a country which promoted freedom around the world, across much of the world, right? And this is also a paradox, right? This Cold War went on, and once again we see Soviet caricatures which mark the British Empire, the proud English lion, and behind it we see the boot of the American master, and there is a British bureaucrat kissing the boot of the American master under the guise, under the skin of this proud British lion. Well, in the United States, I mostly tell you about the relationships between Russia and England, but at this time we cannot leave the United States out of the equation. Or rather, I also told you about the Russo-American relationships in the 18th century, when the United States got its independence. And now we come back to the role of the USA in this Cold War, because largely due to its influence in the world, it was, of course, the American anti-Soviet and anti-Russian sentiment that fueled these sentiments in Europe and in Britain in turn. And this epoch, we can call it a phenomenon or a period in the American history, is called McCarthyism. McCarthy was Secretary of State who started this campaign of the Red Scare. They were so much afraid of communists that they invested a lot of efforts and a lot of money in countering the communist appeal in the West. Because after the war, after the Second World War, a lot of people in the West saw Russia and the USSR as another pole, as another alternative to how the society could evolve. Of course, they didn't know many of the nuances that we had here in the Soviet Union, but the idea that a country which was nominally ruled by the people and who had crushed the Germans and showed a lot of success in industry, in science. Of course, that was appealing to many people. And of course, when people looked at the downsides of capitalism and exploitation, they couldn't but see this appeal. And there were a lot of people who sympathized with the socialist ideology, who campaigned for the rights of the workers. And also it was partly under the influence of the Soviet Union that conditions of the working people in the West improved. Like the number of working hours reduced, that people started to be paid for their holidays. It's also something that we take for granted now, that we get paid for our holidays, that we actually get official holidays. But it wasn't always like this. In the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, in the wild versions of capitalism, such things did not exist, and there was a lot of exploitation. Not that I'm arguing in favor of socialism over capitalism. I'm no longer doing this, but of course there were the downsides of the capitalist economy, which drove people in the West towards the USSR. And McCarthy, in these terms, was a successor of Harry Truman. He was wildly afraid of the communist government in the USA. And so they started a campaign, a propagandist campaign against the Soviet Union. Well, films like this appeared. Is This Tomorrow? America under Communism. And here you see communists killing people, taking them hostages, and burning the flames of a revolution in the USA. Or, for example, this is iceberg of communism, and here you see a symmetry of countries who had already broken on this iceberg: Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, China, North Korea, East Germany, and the USA on course to this communist iceberg. Or, for example, this: Americans, don't patronize Reds. You can drive the Reds out of television, radio, and Hollywood. This tract will tell you why we must drive them out. The Reds have made our screen, radio, and TV Moscow's most effective fifth column in America. It's interesting to read it now because, well, Hollywood at the time was largely red. There were lots of pink or red film producers and actors, and there were huge purges. Lots of people were thrown out of work, and McCarthy paid special attention to Hollywood because, of course, this is the engine of the propagandist machine. And he made sure that there were no people who sympathized with the communist ideology in Hollywood. The Reds of Hollywood and Broadway have always been the chief financial support of communist propaganda in America. Our own films, made by Red producers, directors, writers, and stars, are being used by Moscow in Asia, Africa, the Balkans, and throughout Europe to create hatred of America. Right now, films are being made to craftily glorify Marxism, UNESCO. So it was a sin, a crime to glorify UNESCO in that time. And one worldism, I think it just leaves you speechless. So the Reds were advocating in favor of one world, of globalization. And in the United States, that was perceived as a threat. They didn't want one world. They didn't want globalization. And VAU TV said they're being piped into your living room and are poisoning the minds of your children under your very eyes. So remember, if you patronize a film made by Red producers, writers, stars, and studios, you're aiding and abetting communism. So in 1954, the Communist Control Act outlawed the Communist Party of the United States. It was made illegal. The Communist Party of the United States was made illegal, and it criminalized membership in or support for the party or communist action organizations. One of the first victims of that Red Scare campaign was the US Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, who was so much crazy about the Soviet scare that he really got insane. And when I think he was put into the sanatorium, and then he quit the building from one of the second or the fifth floor with the phrase, "The Russians are coming, the Russians are coming." And that became this, this became, well, an idiom in a way, right? That captures this, this fear against Russia and against the Soviet Union at the time. And later on, it became, the name of a film, of a comedy. The Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. But it wasn't a comedy for James Forrestal in 1949 when he died, with this phrase on his lips. And I think we need to take a break now. So let's take a break, and then we'll finish this lecture after the break.